It's Tom Landry with Home with Tom Landry. I'm here to talk to you today about NAR's $418 million wild settlement that we're hearing all about right now. Obviously, I'm in the real estate world, but unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard about it as well. So what does this mean to buyers? What does it mean to sellers? What does it mean beyond the national headlines right here in the state of Maine? And that's really what we're boiling this down. Now, if you want to read articles about the settlement and how it happened and the history and all these things, you can go find those. There's probably 300 of them out there, right? But what we're here to talk about today, and what we're going to do over the course of the next several weeks, is bring you information that you can use if you're a buyer, a seller, or a potential buyer or seller in the state of Maine, and how all of that national news relates to you, right? So with me today is my associate and colleague, Courtney Collins, and she is fabulous. And what we have been feeling, and literally from the time this first came out to right now, is daily questions. I was interviewed by multiple media outlets. I participated in a bunch of different panel discussions and newspapers to get my perspective on this. But what we've also done is boil it down into a document that we have, and we've sent this out to folks on our email list. So if you want to join that email list, if you didn't get that, you can sign up at benchmarkmaine.com and fill out a little form there. You can also email us at landryteam@benchmarkmaine.com, and Maine is spelled out like the state, landryteam@benchmarkmaine.com. We will send you that introduction to, again, the summary of the whole proposed settlement for the NAR, and again, more importantly, what that means to buyers and sellers. What are the key settlement points that are potentially coming out here over the next, later on this summer, July or August, and again, how they relate to you. So big picture, Missouri clients found an attorney who had a sympathetic ear to their plight, and the idea of buyers potentially being steered to properties, one tenet of their case, being steered to properties where those real estate brokers, the buyer brokers, were potentially making more money. Maybe not the right property for the buyer, but the agent was making more money, and therefore those agents in some of the states, not Maine, and we're going to talk about that later, can sort by which listings in the municipality pay them more or less, right? So then they're steering them to ones where it's lining their own pocket, right? Kind of sad. The other side, and another key tenet of this case, was the fact that if I'm working with you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I then am potentially negotiating and then putting it on multiple listings, a commission for a cooperating agent. So fundamentally, should a seller determine and be responsible for the commission paid to somebody they don't have a relationship with? And obviously that's a weird concept, right? I'm not hiring this person, but therefore you're the intermediary, the listing agent, and then you're causing me to pay this person. So they're decoupling of that, and really, as opposed to fighting this, a few weeks ago, the National Association of Realtors said, hey, we're moving beyond this, we're going to settle it, and underneath the terms of that settlement, there's a bunch of things that they've agreed to, and we will, again, share those with you if you send us that email. You can also go to Home with Tom Landry, and I did a whole hour-long segment about this on Facebook Live just this past weekend. That is also posted at Home with Tom Landry. And we get into all of the nuance and answer a bunch of questions, but that's the point of today. So Courtney is with me. She's going to ask me questions that we've received via Facebook and via Home with Tom Landry's website, and also via email from our clients. So tune in. It's going to be fast moving. Thanks for your attention.
So I think you just really nailed one of the biggest questions that we've been getting, and it's coming from people who are seeing all of these huge headlines about 6% commissions are a thing of the past. So I'd like to ask about that. Does this mean that sellers no longer have to pay 5 to 6% commissions?
So, going back to what I was just saying, they never had to, right? So, and I just had a meeting, and you were actually part of that meeting. Courtney's on my team, and she's fabulous. And we were just talking with sellers about they always had options, and you and I know this, from flat rate brokerage where they would come in and say for $1,000 or $500 or $2,000 or whatever that number is, we'll list your house for that. We've had agencies out there which have said, I'm going to just help you sell it yourself. We're going to do something called enter only, where you do everything and we're just going to put it in multiple listings for you. We've had 1%, 2%, 5% flat fees. You name it. It's been every color of the rainbow, and that's always the way it's been. So sellers have always been in control and never had to pay any of that. You could sell it yourself and do everything yourself. So again, you've been in control. You never had to. But it does unlock a whole nother thing. So if the industry has been operating this way for the last 100+ years, right? And it's gone from, let's just say it was 8 or 10% commission 50, 60, 70 years ago, down to an average right now about 5 or 6%. And that commission is usually split between the buyer and seller broker. If we have a significant departure from that, is that something, if we put on that seller's hat, and I think that's probably where that question is coming from, do I have to pay that? You don't have to pay it, but probably you should. And you probably should pay that buyer broker, right? And that's part of the initial way that commission was done is I would meet with you as the listing agent. We would negotiate an overall commission, and then I would cooperate with another party and give them a portion of that overall commission. So what we're telling our clients, as you know, is we shouldn't depart from that. We want a good qualified buyer broker, and you're going to want to compensate them, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, because it's the easiest way to get the deal done, as opposed to putting that financial burden to pay that agent on the buyer. So you don't have to, long story short, but you probably still should.
Awesome. So that really leads me perfectly into my second question. If the seller chooses not to compensate buyer's agents, is there any correlation between that and my final sales price?
Yeah, so good question. If a seller says, hey, I'm not going to pay the buyer broker, I think the perception is that they're going to be putting more money in their pocket. Maybe not. As a listing agent, I do a tremendous amount of listing work. And I'm going to push that seller to still offer the 5 or 6%, depending on the price point of their property. There may be a time there too, again, whether we agree to it up front and we say, hey, we're going to pay a buyer broker this, or that buyer broker may come in when they make that offer with that buyer and demand to be paid that. They're not going to work for free. So either it's going to come out of the seller pivoting off of that initial stance where they're not willing to do that, or it's going to come from the fact that the buyer is going to pay a little less for that house because the money has to probably come from somewhere. So I don't think the net difference is going to be changed for the seller. I think the sellers are going to walk away with the same amount of money. They may initially think, hey, I'm hearing this and this is great for me, right? I'm going to save 2 or 3%. I think in reality, that's not going to be the case. It should be, and it should be, right? This idea of should, and it's in their best interest for it to be pretty much what it is now.
Awesome. So how do you think that this will affect first-time home buyers?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're feeling a tremendous amount of that. And as you know, we're working with a whole group of first-time buyers right now. We just had a closing yesterday, and fortunately, they got in before this change. So it's going to depend on the person who they're teamed up with, right? But first-time home buyers are the ones I worry about the most because they're the most vulnerable in the whole process. If I bought and sold 5 or 6 homes, I'm probably by that time pretty savvy about what I need to worry about and what I should be doing and navigating inspections or asking great questions and exploring financing options. Making sure the purchase and sale is written in a way and on the type of form that protects me, right? And there's a balance form between me and a seller. But unless you've really done this, and most people only buy and sell 2 to 3 properties in their entire life, right? So it's one of the most important financial decisions, but we only do it very frequently, right? So you need a guide. You need somebody who's really, really good, especially if you're a first-time home buyer, right? There's so many pitfalls. The worry is if agents are not compensated commensurate with their experience, Many of the very, very good agents are not going to do this, or they're going to focus back exclusively on listings, which leaves that population exposed. The other thing you worry about, we've been asked this as well, will this give rise to other models of business out there where it's a flat rate to represent a buyer? I worry about that too. It's the big boxification of buyer brokerage, right? Well, that's quite an alliteration. We're dumbing it down. Something that's so important, we're dumbing it down. And this isn't like, hey, you got a week's worth of training and suddenly you're a buyer broker. It's so much more complicated. So I really, really feel for first-time buyers. The hope is you wind up with a really accomplished team that can have you work with somebody, and even if they don't make as much on that, they're still going to do the right thing by you because they're making it up in other ways with sellers who get it and are willing to pay you, or that team has enough other business through mostly working with listings maybe, where they can dedicate a staff member to really work for you without necessarily cutting back on anything.
Do you think that this will cause a drop in sales prices?
Yeah, another question. I was asked that by one of the news outlets. The very first day this became news, I was interviewed by 2 or 3 newspapers plus a couple of TV shows, and they want that clip. They want that. There's a perception, and this is part of that lawsuit. And if you hear the attorneys, the plaintiffs' attorneys, they talk about house prices being inflated and these bidding wars and sort of the passive sort of thing there, and not so much just passive. It's sort of the idea of these almost like greedy agents, right? We've driven up the prices, and we've created the scarcity. Those things couldn't be any further from the truth. It's not going to lead to price drops. It's not going to lead to more inventory. And again, that's something where buyers may be hoping for that, right? This idea of I've been a part of bidding wars. It's been so difficult to be a buyer. Maybe this will lead more sellers to list because they're not paying as much, right? I'm not paying as much commission, therefore now's my time to list. I think the dynamics of that are off. If a seller is not listing, there's a whole bunch of reasons probably they're not listing. On top of that is they then become a buyer in a very tight market where there's very little inventory. And let's not forget, they're in interest rates that they were secured most of the time 3 or 5 or 10 years ago, which are much lower than they are today. So that is a compounding factor that is not going away right now. Interest rates are not dropping down. So I think it'll have zero impact on dropping prices, and it'll have zero impact on the amount of inventory that comes on.
Do you think that this will lead to agents leaving the industry?
Yeah. So, we just got out of a company meeting, and I think there's a lot of folks out there that have made a career, not so much the agents in our firm, because we're in a boutique firm, and I think the agents are really treat this like a profession and have a broad book of business. Again, we get the folks that are, 5 years, 10 years into the industry versus some of the newer folks that come into the industry right away. But when you're first starting out, it's very easy to work with buyers. It's nothing you really have to pitch that person on. A lot of times it's your personal connection. Maybe they're a friend of yours. They like you, they respect you as a person. And oh, by the way, I want to buy a house. And you have your license. And you're opening up doors and you're providing advice, and hopefully you're on a team that gives you some mentorship. But again, that's a much easier way to break into the industry as a buyer broker. And then there's also agents who have said, hey, I really like this. And you and I have talked about this, Courtney, that I enjoy working with buyers because it gives me fulfillment to really help somebody move from an apartment into this or buy that first house. It's part of the American dream. It's really, it almost gives you goosebumps, right? But then if they specialized in that and they were almost exclusive buyer brokers, I do think a lot of them are going to be facing some really, really rough times because you also think about, okay, I'm going to do all this work, and people don't understand this. It's not an hourly thing. We don't get paid, right, until you close. And I've had people search for over a year. You're showing them 40 and 50 houses. And it isn't like you're just showing them condos on the peninsula of Portland, for example. It could be within an hour or an hour and a half radius of an area. So if you look at the hourly amount that you're making over that course of that year or so, even 6 months, it can be very, very low, but the idea is all of that work eventually is going to pay off because you get a decent amount of commission coming from that seller. Boy, if that goes away, and then if I have to charge that buyer maybe an hourly rate, boy, that changes the whole dynamic. So I think it becomes a very difficult thing, and I do think if I was venturing, I'd say in a year from now, we could be talking about 30 to 40% of the buyer brokers leaving the industry, which is not necessarily bad. We had a tremendous lead up to this moment right now where a lot of people got in the industry. And I think there's also a bit of a dumbing down about what it means to be in our capacity to work with buyers and sellers. It's a very, very serious thing. It's not just like, I've always liked decorating homes or I always liked, dealing with people. It requires somebody who's really well trained and well licensed, and maybe a shakeup in that and a little bit of a dropout of some of the folks that don't treat it that way is okay.
Yeah. Do you think that Maine is ahead of the fold a little bit with some of the changes that are being proposed?
Yeah, it's a whole other part of what we've been trying to talk with clients about. We've done a tremendous amount of this, as you know, on our blog, and if anybody wants to learn more, they can go to benchmarkmaine.com and get on our blog. As you know, you guys have been tremendous about getting this information out there. And what we have done is take this juggernaut of a subject and try to boil it down to what the settlement is, and then out of that really hone in on a couple of the key components out of that and how they affect buyers and sellers. So we have a fact sheet about that. They can get that again on the website and download that. They can reach out to us at landryteam@benchmarkmaine.com, and we can send them that sort of information about, again, how it relates. I think the nice things about our state is we've always been consumer focused, and we've been a state that has really taken that serious, and we've had a very active and engaged Association of Realtors, Real Estate Commission, and our documents are really second to none nationwide. And again, they're very consumer focused. So things like, and part of the settlement was, if you're working with a buyer, you have to have an agreement with that buyer that shows that you have an official agreement with them. Well, that's been in existence, as you know, in Maine for a decade. And it has to be in writing. So a lot of this stuff really doesn't apply to Maine and the way that we do business here. So I think that's part of what we're trying to boil down to, because there's a lot of chatter. You're reading something in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or something. How does this big case relate to real estate here? That might have been happening somewhere else. It may have been bad practices somewhere else. Even things like, as you know, part of the settlement, part of the claim that they were saying is agents were steering their buyers, and this is part of that whole lawsuit, to listings where, as a buyer broker, I'm going to make more money. Well, some multiple listing services, right, where agents search and that feed all of these different sites like Realtor and Zillow and others, you could go in other states, not in Maine, again, we're consumer focused, but in those other states, you could go in and sort the listings in a municipality by what's going to pay you the most. And then the perception is, though, that agent's going to steer me towards that. Well, we could never do that in Maine. We never had the ability to sort by that and to know which listings are paying us the most. So again, I think we are ahead of the curve. We have wonderful associations here, a wonderful commission. So,
I was planning to list this spring. Should I wait?
You know, it's ironic, and we get that a tremendous amount. So, believe it or not, I received a similar question from my brother, who's in New Hampshire. I'm not licensed in New Hampshire, but the sort of mentality of it, or the question remains, and it's no different anywhere really in the country. You know, if the idea with that is, you know, because of this settlement happens and is going to roll out sometime in mid to late July, and the perception then is maybe as a seller, I don't have to pay that buyer broker, right? If we're filling in the blanks, and I don't have to pay that 5 or 6%. I'm only paying 2.5 or 3. Is it better to wait for that, and then I can save myself some money? I don't think that. I don't believe that, and I've told my current sellers that, because some people have a bit of a pliable timeline about when they need to do this, right? They could sell this year, they could sell next year. They were maybe thinking about it. And going back to my brother, my message to him was, we're back to a seasonal market where it's really super hot in the spring, and that's what's been the case for many, many years. And it's a great time to sell. Really, April, May, and June are the ideal months to get your house on the market. And then it starts to slow down in July, and especially July 4th weekend through the summer. And then you get another little bit of a bump after Labor Day, and then it sort of tapers back in early November. But that bump in the fall is nothing like the surge in the spring. It's just the days are lighter, it's brighter, it's all these wonderful things that we think about. So don't time it, don't do that. If your goal is to sell this year, especially this year with the election coming up and all that uncertainty which happens with that, especially post-election, we don't know what's going to happen, especially this year with the candidates and all this stuff. So I would say there's a couple of reasons why it's better, maybe three. The election year, this whole settlement and how that shakes out in the marketplace, and is that going to affect buyers? Are buyers going to go, hey, my agent's not going to be paid, and I'm going to be paying them, and I'm just going to freeze for a little while. I mean, how am I going to buy a house? I'm suddenly obligated to pay this person. So there may be buyers pulling back. We may have election uncertainty, and we have the summer slowdown. So yeah, list right now. Let's have a conversation about that right now.
So if I were a home seller and I agreed to pay my listing agent 2.5%, would I be able to offer a lesser amount to buyer's agents to try and help, but not have to pay the same amount I'm paying you?
Yeah, that's a good question too, and I think that's absolutely, I think, going to happen out there. So again, you always had the option to say, I'm going to have 3 or 4 or 5% commission, whatever that is, from nothing to way up to whatever you want. We've already had conversations with owners that say, okay, if it sells by this time, but if it kicks into August and these things come into place, how are we going to handle that, right? So I think these are conversations that are going to come up more and more as we get closer and closer to this settlement being put into effect again in late July. So yeah, I think there's the relationship and the conversation about me listing your house, and what is that fee, and the other conversation is, how are we going to compensate a buyer broker when they come in? And that may be the same. And if we think about, for round numbers, we think about 5%, maybe it is that 2.5, right? I'm getting 2.5 to list. And although we can't advertise it anymore, that's another part of the settlement, as you know, that we can't put that online, that we're paying another 2%. If that buyer broker comes in and asks me one-on-one, I want to be able to tell them exactly what I'm going to be paying that person, right? And we need to be ready for them to sort of demand that. Does it have to be half? No. And I do think that is going to become an option where people say, hey, I'm going to give you 2.5 or 3 even, right, as the listing side. And let's plan on 1 for that other side. 1's better than nothing, right? And then maybe then it's a hybrid where that buyer broker gets paid, 1 from the seller and 1,000 or 1% from the buyer as well. So we've got to figure this out. It's a bit of the Wild West. We're going to keep people informed about this as we get more information, and especially towards the end of June when this stuff starts rolling out. And that's part of staying informed, and we're going to continue to do a lot more of this stuff.
So last question. What would you say to a potential home buyer that wants to just work with the listing agent directly? Why do they need you? Right. What are the potential consequences of them not having their own representation?
Right. I think that is I think it's a great question, and I think to me, not everybody needs that, but I would say that's a very, very small percentage of the population. Somebody who's incredibly savvy. But let me give you 2 stories about this. Right. So about 5 years ago, I was in Jackson, New Hampshire, and my wife and I love that area. I've been going up there. We've been going up there for 25 years, right? I've looked at probably 30 or 40 homes. One particular day, we arrive and we see these two properties side by side for sale. My agent that I've been working with wasn't available, and I toured the properties. We were getting some pressure, like a lot of buyers do, to sort of make the offer right away and work with that agent. And I said, look, man, I'm in the industry. You know, I know better than to do that. I trusted this agent. She knows the area really, really well. And although I'm getting this pressure and she's not available, she had an associate that was available. So we finally got a hold of that agent. I was not going to write the offer without their input. And it turned out there was a whole backstory about these properties that local agent knew. And I was ready to make an offer that was a little bit below asking, and I was going to feel really good about getting them. Well, it turned out that they weren't even worth close to that. And you flash forward, when they closed, they went for like 50 or 100 less than what I was ready to offer. Now, here I am, experienced. I knew that market, but I didn't have that quality local buyer broker ready to help me and keep me out of hot water, right? And I would have opened up a whole can of worms about some setback issues, some zoning issues that those property had, some environmental issues that these people knew about. So it's a huge deal, and it's a very important thing. It's one of life's most important financial decisions. And beyond that, it's a lifestyle decision. And it's not something that you can just go into and think, unless you're incredibly experienced and really know the area. And even if you are, I would value and venture to say, like my experience there, make sure you don't fall in that trap of that. But most people, again, that another 99%, they really need somebody there to help them. And it's an incredibly valuable thing. The other story is the one that we were dealing with just recently, where these buyers, we had worked with about 6 months. We had looked at a bunch of different properties. They sort of found one that looked great on the surface, right? Modern, cool, new, all these things. And you guys jumped in, did a little background research, found out a whole bunch of information once you opened up that Pandora's box about the general contractor, the developer, the site, the whole thing. And we were able to make sure that that person went into that deal with protection. Great inspections lined up. We lined them up with the best of inspectors. And they ended up getting out of the deal, getting their money back. And more importantly, you know, they didn't wind up at a house that was going to be a nightmare for them. Now, if they'd done that on their own, I doubt they would have been able to navigate that. So I think it's incredibly important. I hope a lot of buyers don't go out on their own with this. It's too important. Okay, thanks for tuning in. This is Tom Landry with Home with Tom Landry. We're going to have additional information here on the website. If you're not already a part of our mailing list, you can send us an email at landryteam@benchmarkmaine.com. We promise we will get you relevant, timely information, and we will not spam you. So landryteam@benchmarkmaine.com and Home with Tom Landry to stay informed about topics like this. And we're going to continue to get them out every couple of weeks to bring you the latest and greatest information about how this impacts buyers and sellers, but also just about anything related to real estate. Cheers.